professor of law and director of the Center on International Courts and Tribunals. His previous academic positions include the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, King's College London, and Cambridge University. And he was a global professor of law at New York University from 1995 to 2003. He was co-founder of FIELD, the Foundation for International Law and Development, and established programs on climate change and sustainable development. As a practicing barrister, he's had extensive experience litigating cases before the International Court of Justice, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, and the European Court of Justice. In 2003, he was appointed a Queen's Counsel. Some of you may have read or read about his most recent book, East-West Street on the Origins of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity, which blends a personal memoir with the gripping story of two international lawyers, Raphael Lemkin and Hirsch Lauterbach, the father of our late colleague Ellie Lauterbach, who each played a profound part in the development of international criminal law. So please join me at this time in welcoming Philippe Stans to the stage.
Thank you very much, President Lowe, President-elect Murphy, Executive Director, officers, members of the Society. Few groups are likely to assemble today that would better know the shortcomings of international law than this group, which I am privileged to address. You are aware of the confusions, of the incompleteness, of the lack of ordinary sanctions, and of all that might be said in criticism of international law. Yet here you are, assembled in Washington, at no little personal inconvenience, to reiterate your inveterate belief that international law is an existing and indestructible reality and offers the only hopeful foundation for an organized community of nations. There is no paradox in this. Those who know best the deficiencies of international law are those who also know the diversity and permanence of its accomplishments and its indispensability to a world that plans to live in peace. I am happy to join you in what amounts to a timely and resolute confession of faith. These are not my words. They were spoken by Justice Robert Jackson at this Society's annual meeting on Friday, April the 13th, the same day, 1945. The circumstances then were rather different than today. There was no UN Charter, no NATO, no European Union, no GATT, no Nuremberg Tribunal, no Genocide Convention, no Universal Declaration. Justice Jackson set out his vision for the future. Yet today, 7 decades on, it seems to many that we stand on the cusp of a great unraveling, of a return to those heady days when sovereignty meant sovereignty, when individuals and groups had no rights under international law, when states really were in control. Robert Jackson was not just a man of words. Just a month later, he writes to Raphael Lemkin to thank him for the letter he has written, informing him that his recently published book, Axis Rule, is available in the library of the Supreme Court. Jackson borrows the book from the library and keeps it in his office for more than a year. He returns it only after the trial is over in October 1946, but the book seems to have worked its immediate magic. On May the 16th, 1945, less than a month after he spoke to this society, Jackson meets his team here in Washington to prepare a planning memo for Nuremberg. And he personally adds a new crime to the list that is prepared by his staff. Soon after, Lemkin is hired by the United States government to work on war crimes with Jackson's team. 2 months later, Jackson is in London, working on the draft statute of the Nuremberg Tribunal. Facing various difficulties, on July the 29th, he travels to Cambridge to have lunch with Hirsch and Rachel Lauterpacht in the garden at Cranmer Road. They sit in the garden of Lauterpacht's home. You can actually see him here in his garden in Cranmer Road, having tea and discussing the possible list of crimes over which the tribunal might exercise jurisdiction. Lauterpacht puts forward various ideas, including the insertion of titles, to help public understanding and to add legitimacy to the process. Jackson reacts positively and takes the ideas with him back to London. These are some of the details that I encountered amongst a great many others whilst researching my book, East-West Street. It took 7 years to write, and it tells the story of 4 men, 2 crimes, and 1 city. 3 of the men were deeply involved in the Nuremberg trial, and the book seeks to understand how each man's circumstance contributed to the road that he took, and how those roads together, thus traveled, changed the system of international law. That is the stuff of my daily work and of the daily work of many people in this room. But the book, as the President mentioned, also touches a more personal theme, how 4 interweaving lives influenced my own path as an academic and as a practitioner. It's been described as a double detective story, one that raises significant questions that occupy each and every one of us. Who am I, an individual or a member of a group? And how should the law cast its protective embrace? East-West Street came about totally by accident. In the spring of 2010, I received an invitation from the Ukraine, an email from the law faculty at the university in the city that was called Lemberg during the Austro-Hungarian Empire until 1918, and then Lwów during the Polish years until 1939, and then Lviv after 1945. Would I care to visit and deliver a public lecture on my work on crimes against humanity and genocide, about the cases in which I had been involved, about my writings on Nuremberg, and the trial's consequences for our world today? Yes, I said, I would love to. I accepted, and I spent the summer preparing the lecture I was to deliver. I chanced across a number of coincidences that I considered to be remarkable, although my wife, who is American and is of a more grounded disposition than I am, doesn't think there's anything remarkable about them at all. The first surprise was to learn more about the man who came up with the idea of putting the term crimes against humanity into the Nuremberg Statute. Surprisingly, he came from Lviv, and he studied at the very university that had invited me to give the lecture, although no one who'd invited me was actually aware of the connection. He was born in 1897 in the small town of Żółkiew, about 15 miles north of Lemberg, and moved to the nearby city in 1911. He enrolled at the university law faculty 4 years later. Then in 1919, he went to study in Vienna, then in 1923 to London and the London School of Economics. In 1937, he was elected to the chair in international law at Cambridge, and in 1945, published the academic book that laid the foundation for our modern system of human rights. His name was Hirsch Lauterpacht. And the book, which was commissioned by the American Jewish Committee in 1942, was titled, as you can see, An International Bill of the Rights of Man. It offered a revolutionary idea to give every individual human being certain minimum rights under international law. And he even prepared 20 draft articles, covering much that was new and now familiar, but was certainly not exhaustive. Notable omissions include silences on torture, on discrimination against women, and discrimination against blacks. But his draft bill gave the effect to his personal credo that, and I quote, "the individual human being is the ultimate unit of all law." He came to know Robert Jackson in 1941, and when Jackson visited Cambridge on the 29th of July, 1945, Lauterpacht came up with another idea in respect of atrocities committed against civilians, a matter on which the Soviets and Americans and French were deeply divided. Why not, he suggested, why not call them crimes against humanity? And here you can see the words written in his own hand. Jackson liked the idea and took it back to London. On the 6th of August, 1945, the term was introduced into the Nuremberg Statute and adopted. An innovation, Lauterpacht told the Foreign Office, but a necessary one. The second surprise concerned the man who invented the word genocide, because he also passed through Lviv and he also, remarkably, studied at the very same law school as Lauterpacht, although he only arrived 2 years after Lauterpacht left in 1921. Again, those who kindly invited me were unaware of his connection with the city or the law faculty, and his name was Raphael Lemkin. He finished law school in 1926, became a public prosecutor in Warsaw, and in 1933 wrote an important paper for a League of Nations meeting in Madrid. He proposed new international crimes to combat barbarity and vandalism against people. His focus was not the protection of individuals like Lauterpacht, but rather the protection of groups. But with Hitler having taken power in Germany, nothing came of the idea. In 1939, when Germany invades Poland, Lemkin escapes from Warsaw and eventually makes his way to Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, where he is offered academic refuge. He arrives with little money or personal belongings, but with vast amounts of luggage. Suitcases which are filled, literally, with thousands and thousands of pieces of paper. They are the decrees promulgated by the Nazis in all the countries they have occupied. He's gathered these materials, and now in America, he analyzes them. In 1942, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, here in Washington, D.C., offers him a book contract to examine the Nazi actions and all the patterns of behavior, and the book is published in November 1944. As you can see, it is called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. Chapter 9 of the book has a title with a new word on it. And the word, which you can see in Lemkin's hand, is genocide. It is his invention, the crime of the destruction of groups, a Nazi master plan, an amalgam of the Greek word genos, meaning tribe or race, and the Latin word side, meaning killing. He's disappointed that the Nuremberg Statute includes crimes against humanity, the killing of individuals, but is silent as to genocide and the killing of groups. In September, he travels to London and pushes for his word to be included in the indictment. There's tremendous opposition from Jackson's office, under pressure from Southern senators concerned about discrimination against African Americans, and also from the British, who were concerned about the implications for their colonial legacy. Nevertheless, against the odds, on October the 18th, 1945, the indictment is filed at the tribunal, and it includes the crime of genocide, the extermination of racial and religious groups, including Jews, Poles, Gypsies, and others. By the time the Nuremberg trial opens on November the 20th, 1945, Lauterpacht and Lemkin are both involved in the prosecution teams. Lauterpacht is present in the courtroom with the British, pushing for the protection of individuals. Lemkin remains here in Washington with the Americans, pushing from a distance for the protection of groups. One of the 22 men in the dock that day is this man, Hans Frank, who's the fourth man in my book, East-West Street. From the 1920s, he served personally as Adolf Hitler's lawyer. In 1933, he becomes Bavarian Minister of Justice, and in October 1939, he is appointed Governor General of Nazi-occupied Poland. In August 1942, he visits Lemberg and Galicia after it's been incorporated into the territory of the general government. He announces on that visit the implementation of the final solution in the city and the surrounding areas, And amongst those who are caught up in the horrors that follow are the families, friends, and university teachers of Lauterpacht and Lemkin. For these families and for others, there will be few, if any, survivors. Frank becomes a point of connection. Just 3 weeks after Jackson addressed the society, Frank was caught by the US Army in Bavaria, along with 42 volumes of his diaries and a fantastic collection of artwork. When I say fantastic, I mean fantastic. It includes, for example, this portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, the lady with an ermine, painted by Leonardo da Vinci in about 1489, which hung in Frank's private office in the Wawel Castle in Krakow. Frank's son Nicholas, who I have come to know, tells me that as a young boy, his father made him stand before the painting and slick down his hair like Cecilia Gallerani. But now Frank is in the dock, he is accused, and he is charged with crimes against humanity and genocide. On the first day of the trial, a Soviet prosecutor takes the judges to the events in Lviv in August 1942, in the days and weeks that followed Frank's visit. More than 130,000 individuals killed in the city in that period, including more than 8,000 children. At this point in the trial, early on, Lauterpacht and Lemkin are unaware of the fate of their families. Indeed, they are not yet aware that the man they are prosecuting, Hans Frank, could be directly implicated. On this day, for the first time ever, the terms genocide and crimes against humanity are spoken in open court. I know Lauterpacht and Frank to be there in the same room on this day and wonder if there is a photograph. Lauterpacht's son, Ellie, of whom Judge Schwebel spoke so warmly and accurately a few minutes ago. Ellie Lauterpacht, who was my first teacher of international law, my mentor, later my colleague and my friend, told me there was no photograph. But I thought, let's take a little closer look. I'm a litigator, and I don't leave stones unturned. I came across the archives at Getty Images, the largest collection from the trial. And I spent a whole day going through literally hundreds of those old glass plates, taking each one out of its protective paper sleeve. And then finally, after several hours, I found this photograph, the one that I was so keenly looking for. Lauterpacht sits at the end of the British table, the second on the left, elbows on the table, hands clenched under the chin. If you move to the lower right-hand corner, you can see the large figure of Hermann Goering in an oversized light-colored suit. Move along the bench to the left, 6 along, and just before the image is cut by the protruding balcony, you will see the semi-bowed head of Frank. Here they are, divided by no more than a few tables and chairs, Lauterpacht and Frank together in the same room. The trial lasts for a full year, and judgment is handed down over 2 days, on September the 30th and October the 1st, 1946. The 70th anniversary was marked just last year in Courtroom 600, still a working courtroom and a museum. Time's limited, so I can't address what transpired over the course of the year as the lives of those 3 men became increasingly intertwined. But over time, family stories emerged. In July 46, Lauterpacht learns of the fate of his family and of the direct role played by Frank. Ellie Lauterpacht shares with me his father's handwritten draft of the closing argument of British Attorney General Hartley Shawcross, which he has written, arguing for the protection of every individual human being and the rights of man against the barbarity of his own state. And he tells me that his father never spoke to him of the fate of the family, that he was a private man, not prone to public displays of emotion. And this made for me and for Ellie all the more striking a feature of his father's draft. Over dozens and dozens of pages, the only defendant mentioned repeatedly is Frank, the one most directly connected to the murder of his family. Right at the end of the 76-page handwritten manuscript, Lauterpacht permits himself to be personal, to target the man who sat but a few feet from him in the dock. The handwritten version reflects a rare passion and anger. Lauterpacht writes of the accused, neither have they seriously attempted to alleviate the guilt the anger of the civilized world by a simple admission of guilt. Even the abject confessions with a ring of sincerity about them have been no more than artful evasions. He's referring to Frank. In September 1946, Lemkin learns of the fate of his family and of Frank's role in its destruction. In a New York archive at Columbia University, I come across an undated page of pencil writing in Lemkin's hand on a single sheet of lined yellow paper. As you can see, he's written the word genocide at least 25 times, then crossed them out. He toys around with other formulations, but there, if you look very carefully, and I didn't see it for a long time, right in the middle of the page, hidden amongst the thicket of words, another is crossed out with a line pointing away that resembles an arrow, and that word is Frank. The journeys taken by Lauterpacht and Lemkin and by Robert Jackson in the period after he addressed the society produced an outcome to change the course of legal history and then history itself. The ideas and endeavors of Lauterpacht and Lemkin, expressed at a time of great personal difficulties, influenced politics, history, culture, my life, and your lives. To many, it seems that the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide have always existed, but they did not. Both are the product of creative and inventive minds, of two men driven by their own experiences forged out of the anvil of a single city. While Lauterpacht opted for the protection of the individual and what caused Lemkin to embrace the protection of groups is a matter of speculation. Their backgrounds were similar, they studied at the same universities, they had the same teachers. But if you want to trace the origins of these crimes, you can trace them to Lemberg, to the events at the end of the First World War, and to the city's law faculty. Indeed, you can trace the origins to a teacher the two men had in common, Julius Makarevich, a renowned professor of criminal law. You can even follow the line to a single building and even to the very room where Makarevich shared his ideas on the treatment of minorities, a room I was pleased as an academic to find. Remarkably, despite their common origins, interests, and journeys, it seems that Lauterpacht and Lemkin never actually met. But their ideas touched, and one point of my book, East-West Street, is that ideas matter, that individuals can make a difference, and that personal stories help us to understand these ideas. Let me turn to the personal, something that we lawyers and international lawyers are generally discouraged from doing. I didn't accept the invitation to go to Lviv because of a burning desire to deliver a lecture. I traveled because I wanted to find the street where this young man was born. He was my grandfather, Leon Buchholz, and he was born in Lemberg in 1904. He never once spoke to me of the city, whose inhabitants the wonderful Polish poet Joseph Witlin described as embodying an extraordinary mixture of nobility and roguery, wisdom and imbecility, poetry and vulgarity. My grandfather Leon left Lemberg for Vienna in 1914 when he was 10, when the Russians occupied. In January 1939, he was expelled from Vienna and the Reich because he was Jewish and newly stateless. He was truly a citizen of nowhere. He left behind a wife, my grandmother Rita, and a 6-month-old daughter, my mother Ruth. That first visit to Lviv opened many doors, and East-West Street ended up becoming a personal detective story. Why did my grandfather leave Vienna by himself? How on earth did my mother get from Vienna to Paris in July 1939 as a 1-year-old infant? And why did my grandmother stay behind? I did manage to find answers to those questions and many more buried in the muck of evidence that is our family histories. Many discoveries surprised, not least the fact that my mother owed her survival, and I, in a sense, my existence, to a remarkable, courageous woman who did missionary work on behalf of the Surrey Chapel in Norwich. She was, it turned out, motivated by a particular interpretation of chapter 10, verse 1 of Paul's letter to the Romans, a text for which I have now a deep gratitude. Unexpectedly, I also came across more direct connections between my family and that of the Lauterpachts and Lemkins. I learned that my great-grandmother, Amalia Buchholz, was actually born and lived in the same small town of Żółkiew, the place where Hersch Lauterpacht was born. Indeed, they both lived on this same street, just a few hundred yards apart. It was called Lemberger Straße back then. Elli Lauterpacht and I had known each other for 3 decades before we learned of our shared connection to this street, called by Joseph Roth, the wonderful writer, East-West Street. And later I would learn that Amalia Buchholz's life would end on September the 23rd, 1942, in the kingdom of Hans Frank. And I would learn that the last street she walked on was called Himmelfahrtstraße, the street to heaven, the street that led from the rail platform at Treblinka directly to the gas chamber. Just a month later, Lemkin's beloved parents, Bella and Joseph, walked down the very same street and perished in the very same gas chamber. Amalia Buchholz's life was caught in this curious way between the Lauterpachts and the Lemkins, as it might be said, is mine, albeit in very different ways. It's not easy to explain these points of various connection, but I can say something about the impressions gleaned whilst revisiting that period of acute challenge between 1914 and 1945. Lauterpacht and Lemkin shared a belief that in going forward after the terrible events they had experienced, events about which President Trump's White House spokesman has recently revealed himself to be distressingly ill-informed, international law had a central role to play. At a time of undoubted personal challenge, they put effort into implementing ideas for a workable international rule of law, supported by the American and British and other governments, committed to implementing the 1941 Atlantic Charter with its 3 pillars for a new world order: economic liberalism, human rights, and the outlawing of war. I am not starry-eyed about the system that emerged and with which we live today, but it was at least based on a vision of carefully constructed and reflected ideas and values. If it is to be replaced, I do not see in my country or in this an equivalent process of reflection and thought as to what comes next. Instead, Britain votes narrowly for Brexit, and the US sort of votes narrowly for Mr. Trump. Neither development appears to offer much by way of ideas as to what needs to happen going forward, beyond a shared apparent desire to dismantle that which exists. The British Prime Minister appears to have embraced a hard Brexit strategy, which seems to mean, although we know so little, the ending of pretty much all existing arrangements with the EU. No single market, no customs union, no European Court of Justice. The economic implications of that are slowly beginning to dawn on our Prime Minister, as is the possible, and I would say frankly, likely, severing from the United Kingdom of Northern Ireland and of Scotland, and perhaps also of Gibraltar. Yet, in the face of all of this, the Prime Minister still tells us that if she could, she would take the United Kingdom out of the European Convention on Human Rights. And she also feels able to castigate those who feel a connection to the idea of global humanity as citizens of nowhere, just like my grandfather. Taking back control comes at a price, it seems, and control will be vested, it appears, in a much diminished rump. Where is the vision, the equivalent to an Atlantic Charter for today, a blueprint for world order and law? If there is one, we have not seen it. Instead, global Britain rests its hope on bilateral trade agreements, injections of cash from friends in the Gulf, and investor-state arbitration, can you believe it, as a model to replace the European Court of Justice. Indeed, the idea evoked in the United Kingdom's government's recent Brexit white paper seems, and I speak here as an ICSID arbitrator, so untouched by the reality of knowledge or experience as to be stunning. Mrs. May is rather desperate for trade agreements. That's one reason, no doubt, she hot-footed her way here to Washington to be photographed holding hands with Mr. Trump. That this occurred on the very day the new president finalized an executive order to ban large numbers of human beings from entering this country simply because they happen to hold passports issued by Somalia or Yemen or a few other countries, was, to put it mildly, unfortunate. The Italian chemist and writer Primo Levi, like the United States federal courts, which have spoken thus far, knew to where such sentiments can lead. I do not comprehend, Primo Levi wrote in the preface to the first German edition of his memoir, If This Is a Man. I do not comprehend, I cannot tolerate that a man be judged not for what he is, but for the group into which he happens to belong. The unraveling of earlier accomplishments is not a matter over which Britain has a monopoly. Making America great again, it seems, also requires a dismantling. NAFTA and NATO seem to be in Mr. Trump's sights. But are they? This morning I read that although NATO was obsolete on the 20th of January, somehow his efforts have turned it around, and less than 3 months later, we learn that the organization is no longer obsolete because it has listened to Mr. Trump. And so too for the United Nations, now magically rehabilitated as a consequence of President Assad's supposed use of chemical weapons on his own people in defiance of United Nations dispositions. This apparently caused Mr. Trump to order 59 Tomahawk missiles to be dispatched in the direction of Syria, information that he shared with the president of China, we now learn, whilst eating a slice of the most fabulous chocolate cake imaginable. Perhaps there are grounds in international law to justify the use of those tomahawks when a country uses chemical weapons. But it has to be said that decisions made on the hoof, we know, can be a very dangerous thing. If Iraq taught us anything, it is that. Where is the policy? Where is the plan? Where is the legal justification? What comes next? Teaching and writing about international law, as with litigating and adjudicating, has taught me the importance of context, and in particular, the vital role of historical context. It can assist, it can help us understand from where we have come and to where we might be heading. There are decent and honourable reasons, no doubt, to have cast a vote in favour of Brexit and Mr. Trump, but we know too there are other reasons. And once again, a poison of xenophobia and nationalism, familiar to Lauterpacht and Lemkin and Jackson, and to my grandfather, is coursing its way through the veins of our world. Are we going back to the 1930s? I get asked very frequently at book talks. Are we going back to a time when states could treat their citizens as they wished, without any fetters imposed by international law? For my part, I find it extremely difficult, having gone through the experience of writing East-West Street, an immersion in the world of the years between 1914 and 1945, without feeling an acute sense of anxiety as to what is stirring and where we are heading. A change is in the air, and we can all feel it. A sharp move to identity politics. I felt it in Poland and the Ukraine whilst filming the BBC Storyville documentary that accompanies the book, My Nazi Legacy. I feel it in the United States, even if it is accompanied by a sentiment of this country's remarkable checks and balances and its remarkable constitution. I feel it most acutely, of course, in the country where I live, which is now a place where one former London mayor can offensively evoke Adolf Hitler as a supporter of Zionism, and another former London mayor, who is now Britain's Foreign Secretary, no less, feels able to suggest that the EU and Adolf Hitler somehow shared common aims. And that's when he's not referring to a former US president as part Kenyan to explain his supposedly ancestral dislike of the British Empire. In such times, we would do well not to forget from whence we came or the struggles and experiences of the generation of Lauterpacht and Lemkin. I do indeed oscillate between their ideas, stuck on the tension between the rights of the individual and the rights of the group, between crimes against humanity and genocide. But I have to admire their fortitude and their commitment and their lifelong belief and their actions in favor of that belief on the vital central role of international law for human well-being. International law is a precious thing. Reasonable people, friends even, can disagree on matters of direction and detail, but surely all of us gathered here today, whilst recognizing Robert Jackson's references to the confusions, the incompleteness, the lack of ordinary sanctions, and everything else that might be said in criticism of international law, all of us surely recognize that what we have is not to be taken for granted, is precious, and is worth fighting for. The rights of individuals and of groups, the idea of an international rule of law, a system of justice that includes independent, effective international courts and tribunals. These are decent and important things. And they are decent things for which this society has played and will surely continue to play a vital role. You have been a broad church, a place of vital and impassioned debate. And at no time has the society, a principled, robust, generous, open institution, one that speaks especially for the younger generations in this room today and for future generations, never has it been more important than right now. And so, like Robert Jackson, to the day, exactly 72 years ago, can I say how happy I am to join you in what amounts to a particularly timely and resolute confession of faith. Thank you.
Your applause expresses what words really cannot, but Philippe, in his very moving and remarkable address, has reminded us, as Rosemary did at lunch, of first the very human dimension of the issues we dedicate ourselves to in our work, and second, the values that we all strive to uphold. Now, we have time for questions, and so I would encourage you to take this opportunity to raise any questions that you have. I believe we have some microphones at a couple of places in the room. And so if you'd like to approach the microphone and identify yourself, we can proceed with questions.
I see
Judge Schwebel, we won't, the microphones are not so close, unfortunately. Do we have one we could bring to Judge Schwebel? It's coming to you. It's coming to you.
Okay.
Thank you. I just want to recall one further interface between Hirsch Lauterpacht and Justice Jackson, which was of immense influence. Lauterpacht came to the United States when Roosevelt was assisting Great Britain, standing alone against Hitler. The international law community of the day was if not predominantly, very substantially still critical of Roosevelt's aid to Britain as being in breach of neutrality. It seems extraordinary, but it's true. And Harold Lasky, a colleague of Lauterpacht's at the London School of Economics, wrote a letter to Felix Frankfurter saying that Lauterpacht was coming to America and please introduce him around. And Frankfurter introduced him to Jackson, who was Attorney General. And Jackson asked Lauterpacht to provide a rationale to answer the public international lawyers in the United States who were criticizing Roosevelt's policies and Lend-Lease as being unneutral. And Lauterpacht did that almost instantaneously. Curiously enough, the American Bar Association was holding its meeting in Havana, and the principal speaker was Jackson. And he gave a speech, the essence of which was written by Lauterpacht, updating the meaning of neutrality in the face of Hitlerism. And then he later testified before Congress in support of Lend-Lease using that rationale. And I think it's fair to say that Lauterpacht, who I regard as the greatest international lawyer of his era, had a profound effect on real affairs, not only in the ways that you've so brilliantly described it tonight, but in the way I've just mentioned.
I'm very grateful to you, Judge Schwebel, for adding that information today. I was also very struck by that story. The only additional detail I would add, and you knew him, I didn't, was that Herschel Lauterpacht was an incredibly careful man. And before preparing a draft advice for Robert Jackson, he took the care of going and visiting the folks at the British Embassy here in DC to make sure they didn't object. And having been given the green light, he then proceeded. One of the things that I've learned on this writing project is the incredible significance of points of detail and personal collection in making these introductions. And that, for me, carried through in a remarkable way right through to the finding a US publisher for this book. I'm thrilled to be published by Alfred Knopf, a wonderful publishing house. The way these things work these days is to get published by a half-decent trade publisher. You have to have an agent. I had an agent in the UK. The agent had introduced me with a couple of my last books to my American publisher, who I'd known very well, Melanie. And when the first draft of the manuscript went to Melanie in New York in late 2012, she called me up and she said, "Philippe, how remarkable it is to read this manuscript. It seems that my father and my grandfather were the only two men in the world to have worked with Lauterpacht and Lemkin." I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "My name's Melanie Jackson. Robert Jackson was my grandfather." And it's just sort of these incredible points of connection that
Kismet.
Thank you. My name is Jean Nguyen. I'm with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Thank you. I'm very touched by your keynote address. You talk about crimes against humanity and genocide. I have a question that in the case of the Jews, when the government with the power ordered them to jail and kill them, nobody spoke for them. So in our international laws, in the case of voiceless people, when their own government worked against them, how do they take the case to court under international law? Case in point, the Vietnamese people right now in the South China Sea, when they set out to fish, they got sunk because they are not allowed to fish in the sea of their own anymore. Then their toxic waste being poured into the sea by many steel industries from China came to the south, and they pour toxic waste into the South China Sea. For the last, must be more than a year. It was just a year last week that all the fish along the border of our seas in the East Sea of Vietnam all die and get significant problems with toxic. Even in England recently, there was note that you should not eat fish from Vietnam or the South China Sea because high level of lead and mercury and very toxic waste in the fish. So the people are being killed, but we have no legal stance to bring the case to the International Court of Law. How do we go about that?
Thank you for raising what is obviously a central concern to each and every one of us. We have rules, we have principles, we have values. They're not operationalized. We only need to open our newspapers every day right now and see what is going on. You've mentioned one example, focusing on Syria offers another example. I'm very involved right now in the case of the Yazidi community and what happens to them in relation to their very legitimate concern. What has really touched me in that issue, and I just mention it not because it's more important than any others, but because I've been working with a couple of psychologists in Germany who are who've put in place a program of post-trauma treatment of psychological repair for 1,100 young Yazidi women from northern Iraq who have been systematically tortured, enslaved, raped. I mean, the stories are beyond belief. And one of the things the psychologists say is very important is that in designing future well-being, the sense of the possibility of a route to justice is a very important part of that process. I hadn't really ever focused on how the work that we do as international lawyers feeds into these other domains. And I'm asked the same question by the psychologists. Can you help us find a place to take their case? And it's difficult. It's difficult at the international level because there are vetoes and there are bars. I think at the national level, things will happen. And it's very ironic that right now, it is in Germany that there are both psychological programs of medical well-being and also legal initiatives that are underway, which I think will be announced in the course of this summer. And it's very ironic and I think very sad that both my country, the United Kingdom and the United States, no Yazidis have been allowed in as part of the refugee program, and there is no contribution to the system of well-being and future repair going forward. If you compare now with 1945, how ironic it is to see that reversal of roles. Hopefully it is a blip, hopefully it will change, but I absolutely appreciate the point that you're making.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you? My name is Michael Fromm, and we've been working on the Language of Peace platform together with Cambridge and the UN. I didn't really plan to say anything, but I really was very impressed by your introduction to international law, basically on human rights. And the reason I wanted to get up is I am born in Vienna, I'm Viennese. I studied at the London School of Economics, and we're now working with the Lauterbach Institute in Cambridge. And I thought so I wanted to go up and say something. Because what we did now is this is the first time in mankind that all peace agreements since the existence of the United Nations are digitized, and Cambridge spent a long time tagging 80,000 paragraphs with all the different issues that relate to peace treaties. Talking about serendipity, my mom's name is Elizabeth, and she was born in the Felberstraße. My business partner's name is Michael, as me. His last name is Felber, and his mom's name is Elizabeth. So there's sometimes there's this weird things that synchronize people and brings them together. And my middle name is Andreas, by the way. So I just realized this while I got up here, and I just wanted to say thank you for giving this award to us, because we spent really a lot of time and effort in creating this platform. And I wanted to also say something to the lady that just asked the question before me. I studied law in Vienna too, and I was especially interested in human rights, international law, and also sustainability. And I'm wondering, why does our planet Earth not have a legal personality? I just recently read that New Zealand gave a river a legal person, limited rights, but still the river can sue somebody that dumps chemicals into it. And I'm wondering why our planet is not a legal entity that can sue somebody. Maybe you can explain it to me.
Well, I can't explain it to you, but I can. I can't explain it, but what I can do is I can commend to you the article that I regularly cite to my own students as the finest law review article I have ever read. And it's an article by Christopher Stone, published in the University of Southern California Law Review in 1972, and it's called Should Trees Have Standing? And he then published a book that followed that idea called The Gnat is Older Than Man, a wonderful book published by Princeton University Press. So the points you raise are very dear to me. Congratulations, incidentally, on your award. I think it is very remarkable and wonderful that these backgrounds that you find yourself now as a Viennese working at the Lauterpacht Center for International Law. I think Hirsch Lauterpacht and Ellie Lauterpacht and the other Lauterpachts to come would take great pride in that fact. One of the things that I've come to appreciate is one has to really address these issues with a very open mind. Those of you who've read the book will know that one of the central characters that I have come to know is Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank. Hans Frank was responsible and was hanged for the murder of 4 million people. And getting to know Nick, I've often wondered, what is it like to have a dad who hanged for murdering 4 million people? Just pause for a moment and ask yourself what that means for your life to go through that experience. So he is an individual that I've learnt a lot from, and we have truly become friends, notwithstanding the fact that amongst those 4 million were my grandfather's entire family. And I think it's telling that in the passage of 2 or 3 generations, it is possible for a friendship of that kind to develop. When the film that I made with Nick Frank came out, My Nazi Legacy, when it opened remarkably in cinemas in the UK, we did a series of interviews, including one for a program that many of you will know, the BBC The Today program, which is every morning on Radio 4 from 6 till 9. And we were interviewed by the main person who does the interviews, John Humphreys, probably the most famous radio broadcaster in the UK. And at one point he turned to me and he said, "Philippe, how is it possible that you can be friendly and friend of the son of Hans Frank?" And that question came 3 days after the killings at Bataclan and Paris in November 2015. Shocking killings. My daughter is a student in Paris, so it was very personally connected. My mum is French, and it touched me a lot. And I said, just off the top of my head, I said to John Humphreys, you know, it's a bit like, imagine fast forwarding 70 years to a situation in which a grandson of a victim of the Bataclan killings befriends the son of one of the killers at Bataclan. That's what it means. And the fact that that can happen, and the fact that it can happen against the background of a system of criminal justice, which is hugely important for Nicholas Frank in changing the family dynamic, in changing the dynamic of his community, something he is well worth reading on, I think offers in a rather grim world a note of hope and optimism. And I think that's one of the reasons the book has resonated, is it's not a depressing book. I've somehow managed to find points of light, including of these remarkable men, Lauterpacht and Lemkin.
I think one more question. One last question, please.
Thank you. In 1989, 1990, I had the good fortune to spend a year in England, and I went to visit Elie Lauterpacht and asked him a question which he couldn't answer, and I'm wondering if you might be able to answer it. The question was, there are two versions of Hirsch Lauterpacht's catalog of international human rights. The 1945 version has liberty as the first right, whereas the 1950 version has the right to life. And did you find in his writings any reason why he changed the order? Or, I mean, one could guess from obvious reasons because of the Holocaust that he then added the right to life, but is there anything in his writings that you've gone through that might help explain this.
So isn't it wonderful that this has become an event celebrating Eli Lauterpacht? I love that. I have to say, I really love that and cherish that. And I think he would smile if he could see us talking about these things now. So actually, I know a little bit about it because at one point, Eli asked whether I would do an introduction to the republication of International Bill of Rights of Man. And we had a whole debate. Eli really wanted to publish the 1950 or 51 version, the later one, because he said his dad had had more time, my father had had more time to work on it. And I said, but it's important, but it's not as important as the 1945 one. The 1945 one is the one written in just 2.5 years under incredible constraints of personal, family anguish, and of a world in turmoil. I think what is remarkable of the 1945 edition, and I can't answer your question off on the stage specifically on what happened there, but he did change quite a lot in the later edition because he had more time for reflection than in those febrile moments in 43 and 44, where not only is he teaching and worrying about his family in America and worrying about the family in Lviv, of whom he stops hearing anything after 1941, but he's writing law review articles and books and doing the international law reports. I mean, it's sort of amazing that in those times you could do that. So there will be an answer in there somewhere. Let me finish again just with a word of honor of Eli. One of the great, there were dark aspects of writing a book like this, but there were many wonderful aspects. And one was that I got to spend extended periods of time, even more than I normally do, with Eli, and we would just talk for hours, and he'd take me and show me letters and documents. Extraordinary generosity that Steve Schwabel has evoked. Has there ever been a teacher who is more generous to his pupils than Eli Lauterpacht? I've never come across one, certainly. And at one point, happened more than once, Eli would say to me, Philippe, it's amazing. I learned things from you about my father that I never knew myself. And one of the things I think that happened to Eli, who's analogous to the situation of my mother, who really did not want to talk about these things, is that she was, like Eli, directly involved. He lived through it. My mother lived through it. And for that generation, and I've noticed this talking to people from Kosovo and Yugoslavia and Cambodia and Rwanda, very often the immediately touched generation, including of children, have grown up in an environment of silence, and they take that forward. It's a protective silence, I'm sure. It's nothing malign about it. And Eli lived through that, but he was joyous that someone else had come along and was asking him questions that he had not felt able to answer, I think because they were so very painful for him and in his memory of his mother and of his father. So the question again is one I appreciate very much, not only for its substance, but because it allows me to record my sense of the deepest appreciation to Eli and to so many remarkable people who opened up and shared their remarkable stories, many of them at the end of their lives. And many of them, and I do want to say this because it is important to end, many of the most important people in the book, although it is a book about 4 men, are the women. And if you want to really read and understand the Nuremberg trial, don't read the men, read the women, because they are able to capture in the writings things that the male observers did not. And 3 women in particular, Rebecca West, Martha Gellhorn, and the now little-known Janet Flanner, remarkably astute observers, not only of the facts of what happened, but of the human emotions and interactions that explain the act of happening. And that, I think, is important because the world of international law as constructed today is as much a world which was constructed by these less formal actors as the exclusively formal actors. But thank you very much for your questions.
I should say that for those who want to delve more deeply into the story that we've just heard about, Philippe will be signing copies of his book, East West Street, immediately following this assembly outside the gala reception in Regency B and C. And before we adjourn to that reception, I'm pleased to announce the date and location of the 2017 mid-year meeting of the Society. That meeting will be hosted by our academic partner, Washington University School of Law in St. Louis, Missouri, on October 26th through 28th. Please mark your calendars and plan to meet us in St. Louis in the fall. And now, please join us in Regency B and C for the gala reception sponsored by Cambridge University Press in celebration of our new publishing partnership. Thank you. Thank you for joining us in this collective event. Have a good evening.